The axe sliced through the cold air, stopping mere millimeters from Thyra's neck. Her blue eyes, once filled with fear, now stared unblinking at her uncle. "Do it, and Odin's ravens will carry your soul to Helheim, not Valhalla," she whispered. Behind her, the warrior who had been her master for years lay wounded, watching his once submissive slave confront the man who sold her as a child. Thank you for being here and joining this story. This channel is just beginning, and every subscription truly means the world. It helps keep this project alive as we aim for our first 1,000 subscribers. If you enjoy the tale, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Your support makes all the difference. The night had fallen heavy and silent over the fjord, wrapping the land in a brittle shroud of frost. The cold crept through the cracks of the wooden walls, whispering secrets of the coming winter. Inside the modest cabin, a faint glow from the hearth cast flickering shadows on the rough-hewn beams. The scent of damp earth mixed with the sharp tang of pine smoke and the faintest trace of dried herbs that Thyra had painstakingly gathered during the last days of autumn. It was a place carved out of hardship, a refuge from the biting world outside. 17 winters had etched their mark on Thyra Freyjusdottir, though her frame remained slight, a slender figure shaped by years of labor and restrained freedom. Her pale skin, kissed by the waning light of the fire, revealed faint freckles scattered across her nose and shoulders, remnants of a youth spent under harsher skies. Her straw-colored hair was braided simply, the strands pulled tight to keep them from tangling in the winds that prowled beyond the cabin's walls. She moved deliberately, each gesture measured as she prepared for the day ahead. The morning would come soon, but for now, she remained awake, her breath forming ephemeral clouds in the cold air. Her fingers, calloused and rough from years of work, traced the edges of the small iron bracelet on her wrist, the mark of her thrall status. A symbol that had once bound her with chains invisible but no less real. Outside, the world was muted. The vast expanse of dark water lay still beneath a sky heavy with stars, the cold silence broken only by the distant howl of wolves echoing across the frozen landscape. Trees, bare of their leaves, stood like sentinels guarding the fjord's edge. The wind stirred the snowflakes that had begun to dust the earth, each one fragile yet inexorable in its descent. In the days since the last harvest, the air had turned harsher, an early warning of the winter to come. The villagers moved with a quiet urgency, their faces drawn and their bodies wrapped in thick furs and leather. Theirs was a world defined by the seasons, a fragile rhythm of survival and endurance. For Thyra, each day was a trial, a negotiation between submission and the flicker of unyielding spirit that refused to be extinguished. Her routine had become a ritual, a tether to the semblance of order in a life marred by loss and betrayal. Before the dawn, she would rise to stoke the fire, coaxing warmth from damp logs. Her breath rose in steady puffs as she tended to the small hearth, the flames crackling and snapping, pushing back the cold shadows that pressed against the cabin walls. The scent of burning wood mingled with the earthy aroma of porridge simmering slowly in a worn iron pot. Ragnar Thorson, the man who had been her master for 7 years, lay in the adjoining room, his heavy breathing a steady cadence that mingled with the crackle of the fire. Known across the fjord as the Wolf of the North, he was a man carved by battle and shaped by the unforgiving land. His broad frame bore the scars of countless conflicts, deep lines etched into his skin like runes telling tales of survival and violence. His dark hair fell in tangled waves around his shoulders, a beard thick and bristling framing a jaw that seemed carved from stone. Despite his fearsome reputation, Ragnar's cabin held a strange stillness, a fragile peace that spoke of unspoken pacts and grudging respect. Thyra had learned to read the nuances of his moods, the flare of his nostrils, the narrow glint of his eyes, the subtle shifts in his stance. She moved in the rhythm of his demands, anticipating needs before spoken, donning silence like armor. Yet beneath the surface of their relationship simmered currents of complexity. The winter's chill seemed to press deeper into their shared space, bringing with it an unspoken tension. The past clung to them both, memories of loss, of blood spilled and debts unpaid, casting long shadows that neither dared to confront outright. The flicker of the hearth illuminated Thyra's face, revealing the faint scar that marred her right eyebrow, an old wound from a skirmish with village children, or so she told herself. It was a small reminder of her fractured youth, a crack in the mask of endurance she wore. Her blue eyes, once bright with innocence, now held a guarded sharpness, eyes that had witnessed betrayal more profound than any wound. As the firelight danced across the cabin's sparse furnishings, rough wooden stools, a table scarred by years of use, a simple bed piled with furs, Thyra's thoughts drifted back to the day her world had irrevocably shifted. The day her uncle, Gorm Haraldson, had sold her like cattle, severing the last thread of family she'd known. She recalled the cold weight of his hand as it passed her over to Ragnar, the sharp clink of coin exchanging hands like a dirge. His words had been callous, void of any kinship. "She is strong. She will serve well," he had said, eyes averted. The memory was a wound that never fully healed, a betrayal etched into her very bones. Yet here she was, years later, bound not just by chains, but by something more elusive, a tenuous bond forged in the crucible of shared hardship. Ragnar had been a harsh master, but more often than not, he had been just. He had never raised his hand without reason, never humiliated her in front of his men as others might have. Over time, a silent understanding had taken root, fragile yet undeniable. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the thin window panes and stirring the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. The howling of the wolves grew louder, a mournful chorus that seemed to mirror the unrest in Thyra's heart. The land was preparing for the most brutal winter in decades, and so, unknowingly, were the lives bound within its frozen grasp. The morning light was still distant when Thyra moved to the door, drawing the fur cloak tighter around her shoulders. The cold bit deeper now, seeping beneath layers of wool and leather. She stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath her worn boots. The air was sharp, each breath a white plume that vanished into the pale dawn. Her gaze swept over the fjord's surface, where the first thin sheets of ice had begun to form. Boats rocked gently at the docks, their sails furled, awaiting the thaw. The village lay quiet, houses nestled close like a cluster of bones picked clean by time and hardship. Smoke rose in thin tendrils from chimneys, promising warmth and fleeting comfort. Her heart tightened. 7 years had passed since she'd been torn from the only home she remembered, 7 winters surviving under the shadow of a man she had come to both fear and rely on. And now, whispers had reached her ears, rumors of her uncle's return. Gorm Haraldson, the man who had sold her, was coming back, bringing with him offers and threats wrapped in the cold wind. Thyra's hands clenched into fists, the iron bracelet biting into her wrist like a chain she longed to break. She was no longer the frightened girl sold for a few coins and a sword. Time and trial had tempered her into something fiercer, something unyielding. Yet the thought of facing the man who had betrayed her still stirred a tempest of fear and anger deep within. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open, and Ragnar appeared, leaning heavily on a rough wooden staff. The deep cut on his shoulder throbbed with each movement, a souvenir from a skirmish days before. His sharp eyes, usually so guarded, held an unusual restlessness as they met hers. "They will come today," he said, voice gravelly but steady. "Gorm and his men, to claim what he believes is his." Thyra's breath caught. The weight of those words settled over her like a storm cloud. The man who had once cast her aside as property was now coveting her as a prize to barter. A pawn, though the past gnawed at her, the present demanded her attention. The coming hours would test her in ways she had never imagined, unraveling the fragile threads of loyalty and identity that had held her together. In the depths of winter's grip, when the world seemed destined to freeze over, a reckoning was coming, not just from the biting cold, but from the ghosts that haunted her blood. And as the sun rose weakly over the fjord, casting a pale light across the frozen water, Thyra steeled herself. The woman who had been sold as a slave was no longer the frightened child of years past. She was a survivor, shaped by fire and ice, ready to face whatever storm was coming. The day ahead held uncertainty and danger, but also the faintest glimmer of hope, a chance to reclaim what had been stolen, to carve out a future not dictated by others, but chosen by her own hand. Amidst the whispering winds and ancient stones, Thyra Freyja's daughter prepared to step from the shadows of her past into the uncertain light of tomorrow. The winter sun hung low behind the jagged peaks, casting an ashen glow over the barren landscape. The chill seeped into every corner of the fjord, sharpening the edges of the world like a blade. Thyra moved silently along the narrow path that wound through the skeletal forest, the weight of her breath visible in the biting air. Her every step was careful, cautious, always alert. The last days had brought more than just the threats of her uncle's return. Whispers of suffering and desperation had reached even her isolated refuge. She had heard murmurs from the traveling traders, bits of gossip carried on the wind. A child, left alone after her family was slaughtered in a nearby village. A young woman, cast out and hunted for a crime she might not have committed. A slave girl, traded and tossed aside like refuse. The world was bleeding, and those without protection were the first to perish. Her heart clenched as she thought of those lost souls. The cold did not discriminate, but people did. The weak were left to die in the snowdrifts or fall prey to wolves and worse. Over the years, Thyra had learned that survival was as much about making hard choices as it was about brute strength. She halted at the edge of a frozen stream, peering through the bare branches. A faint noise caught her attention, a soft sobbing, almost swallowed by the wind. Her blue eyes narrowed, scanning the underbrush. There, curled against a moss-covered stone, was a small figure, trembling beneath a threadbare cloak. Thyra's breath hitched. It was a girl, no older than 10 winters, her face pale and streaked with dirt, eyes wide and filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The child's hair was tangled and matted, dark against the pallid skin. She pressed herself against the cold stone as if it could shield her from the world's cruelty. For a moment, Thyra hesitated. The risks were clear. To take in another was to invite trouble, to extend her fragile sanctuary beyond its boundaries. Her own past was a testament to the dangers of trust and kindness in a land ruled by power and blood. Her uncle's betrayal still echoed in her mind, a reminder that loyalty was often a blade turned inward. Yet, as the child's lip quivered and her small hands clenched into fists against the cold, something deeper stirred within Thyra. The embers of compassion, long subdued beneath years of hardship, flickered alive. She stepped forward, careful not to startle the girl. "Child," she spoke softly, her voice carrying the rough edge of steel tempered by warmth. "Why do you hide here alone?" The girl flinched but did not flee. Instead, she looked up, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "They came in the night," she whispered, voice trembling. "The raiders, they took everything. Mother, father, they are gone." Thyra's heart tightened, the familiar ache of loss settling deep in her chest. She knelt beside the child, brushing snow from the girl's tangled hair. "You are safe now with me." The girl's gaze flickered toward the distant horizon, as if weighing the truth of those words. "I have nowhere else. I don't know where to go." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the whispering wind and the distant howl of wolves. Thyra wrestled with the instinct to keep moving, to protect what she had carved out, however fragile, and the desperate need to shield this lost soul. The weight of her own past bore down on her, the betrayal, the selling, the years of servitude. Yet in that moment, she understood that her survival had not been solely about endurance. It had been about holding on to what little humanity remained, about finding strength in connection. She reached into her worn leather pouch and pulled out a small piece of dried meat, breaking it carefully into smaller bits. "Eat," she said gently, offering the morsel. The child hesitated, then took the food with trembling fingers, the faintest spark of hope igniting in her eyes. Thyra rose, brushing snow from her woolen dress. "Come, there is a fire waiting, and a shelter where you can rest." The child stood unsteadily, leaning into Thyra's steady presence. As they made their way back through the frozen forest, Thyra's mind churned with apprehension. To harbor a stranger was to invite danger, especially now, with Gorm Haraldson's shadow looming ever closer. Would Ragnar approve? Would he see this as a weakness or a challenge to his authority? Thyra did not know, but the decision had already been made within her. To turn away was to deny the very spark of defiance that had kept her alive. Back at the cabin, the fire's glow felt like a fragile promise of warmth against the unforgiving cold. Ragnar was there, seated by the hearth, his wound wrapped but still bleeding softly. His eyes, sharp with pain and fatigue, lifted as Thyra entered with the child trailing behind. "Who is this?" His voice was low, cautious. "This is Ira," Thyra replied without hesitation. "She has nowhere else to go." Ragnar's gaze flickered over the girl, lingering on the haunted pain in her eyes. For a moment, the hard lines of his face softened. "You risk much by bringing her here." "I do," Thyra admitted, "but I cannot ignore her." The girl remained silent, shivering beside the rough wooden bench. Ragnar's eyes met Thyra's, searching for the reasoning beneath her resolve. "Winter is cruel," he said finally, "and mercy is a dangerous thing. But so is cruelty." Thyra nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle between them. "She is like me once was, lost alone. If I had been shown kindness then, perhaps things would be different now." Ragnar's jaw clenched, the memory of his own past battles flickering behind his stormy gaze. "We will keep her safe, for now. But if Gorm comes with his brood, she may become a target." The threat hung heavy in the room, an unspoken warning that the approaching storm was not just of ice and snow, but of human treachery. Ira's small voice broke the silence. "Will I be safe here?" she asked, eyes wide and vulnerable. Thyra knelt beside her, meeting the child's gaze. "Here, you will be protected. We will stand together." The girl's lips curled into a tentative smile, the fragile thread of trust beginning to weave a new story. A story neither of theft nor betrayal, but of survival through solidarity. Night deepened outside, and the wind's howl turned to a low moan, as if mourning the innocence lost in these frozen lands. Within the cabin's walls, a fragile alliance was formed, one born not of blood, but of choice. Thyra sat beside the fire, Ira resting against her side, and Ragnar watching over them both with a guarded vigilance. Each of them carried wounds, some visible, others hidden beneath the skin. The past was a shadow that would not easily lift, but in this small sanctuary, the seed of something new had been planted. As the hours stretched into the dark heart of night, Thyra's thoughts returned to the coming confrontation with her uncle. The presence of the child had shifted something within her, a reminder that strength was not measured by solitude, but by the courage to protect what mattered, even when the cost was uncertain. She knew the path ahead would be perilous. Trust was a fragile thing in these lands, and betrayal lurked like a wolf beneath the snow. Yet, for the first time in many winters, Thyra felt the stirrings of hope, not just for herself, but for those who would stand beside her. The dawn would bring more than light, it would bring choice. And with that choice, the fragile threads of fate would begin to unravel, weaving a tapestry of courage, kinship. Ragnar's gaze lifted slowly as she entered, the lines of pain etched deep into his face, softening at the sight of the child. "Who is this?" His voice, rough but steady, broke the silence, cutting through the crackle of the fire. Thyra knelt beside Ira, brushing a stray lock of tangled hair from the girl's pale cheek. "This is Ira," she said softly, her voice low but firm. "She has nowhere else to go." Ira's lips trembled, and she glanced nervously at Ragnar before casting her eyes downward. The sound of her ragged breathing seemed loud in the quiet room. Thyra sensed the child's mistrust, the walls built from years of fear and loneliness, but also the faint, flickering hope that came from being offered refuge, however uncertain. Ragnar shifted, the movement sending a dull ache through his wounded shoulder. "You risk much by bringing her here," he murmured, eyes narrowing slightly. "Gorm's shadow looms closer each day." Thyra met his gaze steadily. "I know, but she is like me once was, lost and alone. I cannot turn her away." A long moment passed as Ragnar studied her, weighing the resolve in her eyes. Finally, he nodded, a grudging acceptance settling between them. "We will keep her safe, for now." Thyra helped Ira to the bench, pulling a threadbare woolen blanket from the pile and wrapping it snugly around the girl's shivering shoulders. The fabric was rough against delicate skin, but it held warmth, a shield against the cold that gnawed at their bones. Ira's small fingers curled around the edge of the blanket, clutching it like a talisman. The two women sat together, the silence stretching, filled only by the soft crackle of burning wood and the distant howl of wolves. Thyra reached into her worn pouch and pulled out a small piece of dried meat, breaking it into tiny shards. She offered the food without a word, watching as the girl hesitated, then accepted the morsel with trembling fingers. Ira's eyes flickered with a fragile glimmer, the faintest spark of trust igniting in the cold recesses of her heart. Thyra swallowed a lump in her throat, the weight of the girl's hunger and fear pressing against her chest. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with peril, yet, in this quiet moment, something fragile blossomed between them, a tether forged not of blood, but of shared survival. Ragnar moved to the hearth, using one hand to tend the fire while the other pressed a cloth to his bleeding shoulder. His gray-green eyes kept a watchful vigil over the cabin's small occupants. The flickering shadows played over the deep lines of his scarred face, revealing a rare softness as he observed the two girls. "You have been caring for me these past weeks," he said quietly, glancing toward Thyra. "I see now you care for others beyond yourself." Thyra looked up, meeting his gaze with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. "If mercy is dangerous, then so is cruelty," she replied softly. "I cannot survive alone, nor should I." Ira's gaze lifted at the exchange, her expression unreadable but attentive. She pulled the blanket tighter around her small frame, drawing strength from Thyra's presence. The hours slipped by in measured stillness. Thyra busied herself preparing a simple meal of porridge and dried berries, the act of feeding both a necessity and a gesture of connection. Ira ate cautiously at first, then with growing hunger, her small hands reaching for the bowl again and again. As the warmth of the fire seeped into her frozen limbs, the child's eyes grew heavy. Thyra lifted her gently, settling her onto a bed of furs in the corner of the cabin. The girl's breath slowed, softening into the rhythms of sleep, the fragile rise and fall of her chest a whispered promise of survival. Thyra sat beside her, watching through the darkened room as the firelight flickered, the dance of shadows echoing the storm of thoughts within her own mind. Memories of her own lost childhood pressed close. The day her parents fell to Saxon blades, the cold betrayal of her uncle's hand passing her across the table, the heavy chains that once marked her as property. But now, in the dim warmth of this refuge, those chains felt less binding. The presence of another fragile soul, saved from the merciless cold, stirred a fierce protectiveness within her. Ragnar's voice broke the silence again, low and steady. You risk everything to save her. Thyra met him in the firelight, her own eyes shining with quiet resolve. Because in saving her, I save a part of myself. He nodded slowly, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. The last winter changed everything, he said, voice thick with meaning. Not just for you, but for all of us. Outside, the wind howled its mournful song, rattling the cabin's timbers as the night deepened. But within, a fragile bond had been forged, a silent pact of protection, of shared pain and hope. Thyra's heart, long hardened by loss and betrayal, found a flicker of warmth amid the relentless cold. For the first time in many winters, she did not feel alone. In the quiet that followed, Thyra allowed herself a rare moment to breathe, to imagine a future where survival was not the sole measure of existence. The child's slow, even breathing became a lullaby, a reminder that even in these frozen lands, life could persist. And as the fire's glow softened into embers, Thyra Freyja's daughter sat watch, guardian of a fragile new beginning born from the ashes of a cruel past. The dawn's fragile light barely pierced the thick veil of mist that clung to the fjord. The world outside the cabin remained steeped in silence, but the fragile peace was already unraveling. News, like wildfire carried on the biting northern winds, had begun to seep beyond the borders of their small refuge. Whispers of a stolen child, a vanished thrall, and the defiance of a feared warlord were spreading through the settlements like a gathering storm. Thyra sat near the hearth, her eyes fixed on the glowing embers as if they held answers to the questions now gnawing at her heart. The weight of the child's safety pressed heavily upon her, a burden she could not set down. Ira, the fragile shadow who clung to life and warmth, slept fitfully in the corner amidst the firs, her breath shallow and uneven. The howl of wolves echoed beyond the cabin walls, a mournful call that seemed to mirror the unrest growing in Thyra's spirit. The last winter had forged something new within her, a fierce protectiveness coupled with a growing sense of belonging. But the outside world was relentless, and soon, the fragile sanctuary would be tested. A soft knock shattered the stillness. Thyra's eyes snapped up, sharp and wary. Ragnar stood at the door, leaning heavily on his staff, his face etched with exhaustion and unease. His scarred hand rested atop the doorframe as he glanced behind him, eyes searching the misty forest. "Trouble comes," he murmured, voice low and heavy. "The word has spread. Gorm's men are not the only ones watching." His gaze settled on her, the unspoken warning lingering between them. Neighbors, traders, even hunters, curiosity will bring them. Thyra nodded, the knot in her stomach tightening. The decision to shelter Ira was no longer a quiet act of mercy. It was a flame igniting unwanted attention. Outside, the village beyond the fjord stirred to life, the usual rhythms sharpened by tension. Men gathered in small clusters, exchanging hushed words that carried far more meaning than the simple gossip of daily toil. Eyes once indifferent now flickered with suspicion and unease. Stories twisted with every telling. An orphan rescued from the cold, a thrall who defied her master, a secret kept beneath the heavy snows. The harsh truth settled like frost on bare branches. In their world, no act went unnoticed, no kindness remained hidden long. The balance between survival and trust was delicate, and the cost of disruption could be deadly. That evening, as the fire sputtered low and shadows deepened, footsteps approached, deliberate and heavy. Thyra's hand clenched around the haft of her axe as the cabin door swung open. 3 men stood framed by the dim light, faces hardened by wind and years of hardship. Their eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked immediately to Ira nestled against Thyra's side. One stepped forward, voice gravelly and edged with suspicion. "We heard whispers in the village. A child taken from the north woods, hidden by the wolf of the North's thrall. His gaze locked onto Thyra. In the days that followed, the small cabin became a beacon of unease. Strangers appeared at the edges of the village, hunters with knowing eyes, traders with veiled questions. The delicate veil of privacy was torn by prying gazes, icy stares that pierced like daggers through the thin walls of Thyra's refuge. Ragnar's wound, though healing, weighed on him, making his movements slow and deliberate. Yet his vigilance never waned. Each night, he patrolled the perimeter, eyes scanning the dark trees for signs of approach. The old warrior, once solitary and fierce, now fought with a new purpose, the protection of those who had become his kin. Thyra, too, found herself transformed. The chains of her past, the iron bracelet that had marked her as thrall, were gone, removed in a quiet ceremony beneath the open sky, a symbol of rebirth. Yet the true chains were those forged by fear and doubt, still binding her heart. She spent long hours sitting with Ira, teaching the child to steady her breath, to sharpen her senses. The girl's eyes, once clouded by despair, slowly began to reflect a spark of hope. Together, they forged a fragile bond, a shield against the encroaching cold of the world beyond. But every moment of peace was shadowed by the looming threat of Gorm Haraldson and the men who still sought to claim what they believed was theirs by blood and coin. Rumors grew, whispers of vengeance, of old debts unpaid, of alliances shifting in the undercurrents of power. One evening, as the sun bled behind the mountains, a messenger arrived from a distant clan. His cloak was heavy with frost, his face pale and drawn. He spoke of councils convened, of voices raised in anger over the wolf of the North's defiance. The news was grim, pressure was mounting, and the fragile alliances that held the region in balance were fraying. Thyra listened, heart pounding, as the messenger laid bare the growing storm. They will come, he warned. Not just Gorm and his kin, but others who see weakness and seek to claim it. Ragnar's eyes darkened, the weight of the coming battle settling on his broad shoulders. Then we prepare? The winter's end does not promise peace, it only sharpens the blade. In the flickering firelight, Thyra felt the first true tremors of fear, not for herself, but for the child who had come into her life like a fragile dream. The world beyond the cabin was closing in, a wild and ruthless tide determined to sweep away the fragile sanctuary they had built. Yet beneath the fear, beneath the uncertainty, a fierce determination blazed within her. To protect Ira was to protect the part of herself that refused to be broken. To stand against the gathering storm was to claim a destiny forged in ice and blood. And so, as the cold wind howled beyond the walls and the shadows lengthened in the dying light, Thyra Freyja's daughter steeled herself for the trials to come. The world had discovered her defiance, and there was no turning back. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the threat more tangible. Whispers from distant clans spoke of shifting loyalties and the brittle alliances that would hold only so long. Rumors of Thyra's sanctuary spread like frost across the land, drawing curiosity and suspicion in equal measure. At the village, gatherings became more frequent, an undercurrent of unease threading through conversations. Eyes watched from behind furs, hands rested wary on weapons. The fragile trust that once bound neighbors was eroding, replaced by fear of the unknown. One afternoon, a group of men appeared at the edge of the forest, faces grim and weathered. Their leader, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, voice carrying the hard edge of command. "We come with questions," he announced. "And warnings." Thyra met his gaze steadily, the firelight flickering across her determined face. "Ask what you must," she replied. "But know this, Ira is under my protection. Any who threaten her will answer to me." The man's eyes narrowed. The world does not bend for the sake of protection. Alliances matter. Blood ties matter. You defy them at your peril. Ragnar's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, a silent reminder of the cost of defiance. The confrontation ended without violence, but the message was clear. The sanctuary was fragile, and the world beyond was closing in with unforgiving intent. That night, as the fire sputtered low and the wind whispered threats through the cracks in the cabin walls, Thyra lay awake, thoughts tangled in a web of dread and resolve. The choice before her was stark: protect the vulnerable and risk the wrath of many, or surrender to the harsh realities of a world ruled by power and fear. Her gaze drifted to Thyra, sleeping peacefully, a fragile light in the encroaching darkness. In that moment, Thyra knew what she must do. To stand for those who could not defend themselves was a path paved with peril, but it was a path she would walk without hesitation. The last winter had changed everything. It had forged in her a spirit unyielding, a heart fierce enough to challenge fate itself. And as the first stars blinked cold and distant above the fjord, Thyra Freyjisdottir embraced the storm to come, ready to face the darkness with fire in her soul. The frozen dawn seeped slowly through the dense canopy of pines that guarded the narrow path leading to the cabin. The frost clung to branches like shards of glass, glinting faintly under the pale light. Inside, the small refuge was wrapped in shadows, the fire reduced to glowing embers, but the tension within those walls burned fiercer than any flame. Thyra sat near the doorway, her eyes sharp and unyielding as they scanned the horizon beyond the snow-covered clearing. Thyra nestled close beside her, wrapped tightly in thick furs, her breath shallow but steady. The child's small hand clutched Thyra's with a fragile trust that spoke of desperation and hope intertwined. Though the girl had been silent most of the night, her eyes flickered with a restless awareness, as if sensing the storm gathering just beyond the trees. Ragnar stood just inside the hearth's dim glow, leaning heavily on his staff, his face taut with pain and weariness. The wound on his shoulder, though bandaged, still oozed dark stains onto the linen wrap. His gray-green eyes were piercing, restless, ever watchful for the first sign of danger. "Today, it comes," Ragnar said quietly, his voice rough like gravel stirred by the wind. "Gorm Haraldsson's men are no longer alone in their hunt. The clans have heard of your defiance. Some will come to claim, others to punish." Thyra's jaw tightened. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the haft of the axe resting beside her feet. 7 long winters had forged her into something hard and unyielding, but nothing in those years had prepared her for the final reckoning looming at their doorstep. "I will not surrender, Thyra," she said firmly, voice low but resolute. "Nor will I bow to the twisted claims of blood or coin." Ragnar's gaze softened ever so slightly. "You have grown beyond the thrall you were once named. This winter has forged a shield around you both, one made of fire and iron." His lips pressed into a thin line. "But steel can bend and break if not wielded with care." Outside, the wind stirred, carrying the distant sound of voices and the crunch of boots on frozen earth. The men were coming. The promise of battle hung heavy in the frozen air. Thyra rose slowly, every movement deliberate. She wrapped the thick fur cloak tighter around her shoulders, the weight a reminder of the world beyond these walls, a world that demanded strength or submission. The iron bracelet that once marked her servitude was gone, replaced by the bare skin of a free woman. Yet the scars it left were etched deep within her spirit. Ragnar stepped forward, his hand briefly resting on Thyra's shoulder. "If they break through, fight not just with blade, but with the truth in your heart. They seek to take what they think belongs to them. Show them what belongs to you." The words settled like a solemn vow between them as the cabin door creaked open, letting in a cold gust that carried with it the harsh reality of the moment. Outside, a dozen figures emerged from the swirling mist, their breath like smoke in the icy dawn. At their head was Gorm Haraldsson, his once ruddy face now pale and drawn, eyes burning with a fanatic hunger. Behind him, Warriors clad in furs and leather brandished axes and spears, their faces masks of grim determination. Beside her, Ragnar fought with brutal precision, every strike a testament to his fierce loyalty and unbroken spirit. Blood stained the snow, mingling with the tears of winter's icy breath. Thyra was ushered to safety by a handful of trusted allies, hidden away where no foe could reach. Despite their numbers, Gorm's men faltered against the determined defense. The Wolf of the North and his companion were a storm neither expected, unyielding, fierce, and burning with a purpose that transcended mere survival. At one point, Thyra found herself face to face with Gorm once more. The man's eyes were wild, rage and desperation twisting his features into a mask of madness. "You will fall, girl," he snarled, swinging his sword with reckless fury. "You belong to me." Thyra parried, her breath ragged but steady. "I belong to no one." Her voice was a cold, sharp blade. "Not even you." Their blades clashed, the sound ringing sharp and clear amidst the chaos. With a quick, practiced movement, she sidestepped and drove the haft of her axe into Gorm's ribs. The man staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Enough!" Ragnar's voice cut through the din like a command from the gods themselves. "This ends now." The fight slowed, the combatants pausing as the weight of the moment pressed down. Gorm, bloodied and beaten, glared at Thyra with a mixture of fury and reluctant respect. "You are no mere thrall," he spat. "You fight like your father." Thyra stood tall, sweat and blood mingling on her skin, her chest heaving with exertion and defiance. "Then you will learn that blood does not bind. Freedom is forged in fire and choice." Ragnar stepped forward, his wounded shoulder a testament to the cost of their stand. He looked at Gorm with cold clarity. "Leave this place. Take your men and your claims elsewhere. We have no need for your treachery." For a long moment, Gorm's gaze wavered. Then, with a bitter curse, he turned away, signaling his men to follow. They retreated into the swirling mists, their silhouettes fading like shadows fleeing the dawn. The battle was over. Inside the cabin, the silence was heavy with exhaustion and relief. Thyra sank onto the rough wooden bench, her hands trembling as she wiped the grime and blood from her face. Ragnar knelt beside her, pressing a cloth to his still bleeding wound. "You survived," he said softly, voice thick with emotion. She met his gaze, the weight of everything that had passed between them settling in the quiet space. "We survived," she corrected. Ragnar nodded slowly. "The last winter did more than freeze the land. It thawed what was hidden inside us, strength, courage, and the will to claim what is ours." Her eyes glistened with an emotion she scarcely dared name. "I am no longer the girl sold like cattle. I am Thyra Freyjasdottir, free woman, protector, warrior." He smiled, a rare, slow curve that softened the harsh lines of his face. "And I am honored to stand beside you, not as master, but as equals." Outside, the first light of spring began to touch the horizon, promising renewal and change. The snow would melt, and with it, the old bindings and shadows. But the scars remained, a reminder of the cost of freedom and the price of defiance. In the days that followed, Thyra and Ragnar tended to the wounded, rebuilt the battered shelter, and prepared for the uncertain road ahead. Ira's laughter, fragile yet persistent, echoed like a song of hope through the cabin's walls. The world beyond was ruthless and unforgiving. But inside this small sanctuary, a new chapter was unfolding, one not written by the hands of oppressors, but by those brave enough to seize their own destinies. And so, beneath the watching eyes of the ancient gods, Thyra Freyjasdottir stood at the threshold of a future forged in fire, ice, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen kinship. The last winter had changed everything, and in its frozen grip, a free woman had been born. The cabin's silence was profound after the retreat of Gorm Haraldsson and his men. The heavy breaths of the survivors filled the cold air, mingling with the faint crackle of the dying hearth. Outside, the howling wind had softened to a mournful whisper, as if the very land mourned the violence it had witnessed. Inside, the warmth from the fire struggled to push back the fatigue and pain that settled deep into the bones of those who had fought. Thyra sat on the rough wooden bench, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline that had coursed through her veins mere moments before. Her blue eyes, sharp and clear despite exhaustion, surveyed the small room where the echoes of battle still lingered. Blood stained the worn floorboards, mingling with the ash and dirt that told silent tales of survival. The faint scent of iron, sweat, and pine smoke hung thick in the air. Beside her, Ragnar knelt low, clutching his wounded shoulder. Yet, the shadows of the past remained, a reminder that their peace was fragile and won only through sacrifice. The scars on their bodies and souls told stories that could not be erased, but they also bore witness to the strength born of endurance. One clear morning, as the sun broke fully over the horizon, casting golden light across the fjord, Thyra stood at the edge of the frozen shoreline. The iron bracelet that had once marked her as property was gone, replaced by the bone pendant resting lightly against her throat. She breathed deeply, the crisp air filling her lungs with the scent of pine and salt. Behind her, Ragnar and Thyra approached, their footsteps light on the thawing earth. The three of them, warrior, free woman, and child, stood together, a testament to the power of survival and the courage to choose one's own path. Gorm Haraldsson's shadow had been cast aside, his claims rejected not just by steel, but by a truth that could not be bought or sold. Thyra had reclaimed her name, her honor, and her future. In the quiet that followed, a gentle peace settled over the fjord. The last winter had changed everything, not just the land, but the hearts of those who called it home. Thyra Freyjisdottir was no longer a thrall. She was a woman forged by fire and ice, free to walk her own path beneath the watchful eyes of the gods. And in that freedom, she found not just survival, but redemption. The first light of dawn crept quietly over the fjord, spilling soft gold across the snow-dusted fields and frozen waters. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and thawing earth, a fragile promise of the changing season. In the village nestled along the shore, the people stirred slowly, their breaths misting in the cold morning as they moved about the familiar tasks that had once felt so burdened by fear and suspicion. Gone were the whispered rumors that had once poisoned the air like bitter frost. The wounds of winter, both seen and unseen, were beginning to heal beneath the gentle touch of spring. The villagers, hardened by years of hardship and loss, found themselves drawn closer by the trials they had endured together. The shadow of Gorm Haraldsson's claim and the violence it brought had faded, replaced by a cautious hope, a hope forged not in conquest or power, but in the shared understanding of survival and the fragile bonds of trust. Among them moved Thyra Freyjisdottir, no longer the thrall marked by an iron bracelet, but a woman reborn in the crucible of fire and ice. Her presence in the village was at once familiar and new, a symbol of endurance and transformation. Her blue eyes, once guarded and wary, now held a quiet strength, tempered by all she had endured and all she had chosen to become. Thyra walked close beside her, the child's small hand wrapped in Thyra's own, a living testament to the new life that had been nurtured within their fragile sanctuary. The village had accepted the girl not simply as a ward, but as a member of their growing family, one whose survival had become a shared responsibility. Her laughter, once hesitant and rare, echoed through the wooden halls and open fields like a song of renewal. Ragnar Thorsson, the wolf of the north, moved among the villagers with a presence less formidable than before, softened by the bonds he now shared with Thyra and Thyra. His scars remained, silent witnesses to battles fought and won, But beneath the surface lay a man reshaped by the harsh winter and the unyielding spirit of those he had come to call kin. The fierce warrior had become protector, mentor, and companion, roles embraced not out of obligation, but choice. The village, too, had changed. Long-held traditions rooted in rigid hierarchies and bloodlines softened beneath the weight of recent events. The old ways, though not abandoned, began to bend toward a future where strength was measured not solely by birthright or the cold edge of a blade, but by the courage to stand for others and the will to rebuild from ruin. At the heart of the village stood the longhouse, its wooden beams weathered but strong. Around its fire, elders and warriors gathered, their voices weaving stories that honored the past while acknowledging the lessons carved by the winter's hardships. The tale of Thyra's defiance and survival had become one told with reverence, a saga of a girl sold into chains who forged her freedom with axe and will. It was a story that would be passed from one generation to the next, a legacy of resilience and hope. One crisp morning, as the sun climbed higher and the snow began to melt into rivulets that sang down the hillsides, Thyra stood at the edge of the fjord, gazing out over the water that mirrored the awakening sky. The bone pendant Ragnar had given her rested lightly against her chest, a talisman of protection and a reminder of the bond they shared. The iron bracelet that had once bound her was gone, discarded in a quiet ceremony beneath the ancient oaks where the village sought the gods' blessing for renewal. Beside her, Ragnar's heavy cloak billowed in the spring breeze, the scent of pine and earth mingling with the faint trace of smoke from distant fires. His eyes, sharp and watchful, met hers with a quiet understanding. Words were needless in that moment. Their shared history spoke volumes. The battles, the betrayals, the moments of vulnerability and strength. Thyra, now sturdier and blooming with the tentative joy of youth, gathered wildflowers from the thawing meadow, her laughter ringing like a bell through the crisp air. Thyra smiled, the sight anchoring her to the present and the future she was shaping, not just for herself, but for those who would follow. The villagers had begun to look to Thyra not just as a survivor, but as a leader forged by fire and tempered by compassion. She moved among them with purpose, her voice steady and sure as she spoke of rebuilding, of forging alliances that honored not just blood but shared humanity. The old wounds of division were not forgotten, but they were healed by acts of kindness and the recognition that survival demanded unity. In the days that followed, the community gathered for a feast beneath the open sky, an ancient tradition renewed with new meaning. Fires roared, casting warm light on faces uplifted by song and story. Mead flowed, and the air was thick with the sense of roasting meat, fresh bread, and herbs gathered from the thawing earth. Children chased one another through the crowd, their laughter weaving a tapestry of joy that had long been absent. Thyra stood at the fire's edge, her gaze sweeping over the gathering with a heart both heavy and light. Among the crowd was a figure new to the village, a traveler from a distant clan, bearing news and gifts. She had come seeking refuge and had found kindness, welcomed by the community that had learned to extend its arms wider in the shadow of the harsh winter. That night, as the stars traced their ancient paths above the fjord, Thyra sat beside the fire with Ragnar and Thyra. The crackling flames painted their faces in flickering gold and shadow, reflecting the complex dance of past pain and future hope. "I never thought I would see this," Ragnar murmured, his voice low and rough as the earth beneath them. "Not just the land thawing, but the hearts of these people." Thyra's eyes shone in the firelight, reflecting the fierce determination that had carried her from slave to woman free. "The gods weave strange paths," she said softly. "We are all bound by threads we cannot see, threads of loss, of love, and of choices." Thyra leaned into her, the child's small hand finding hers once more. "Will the winter come again?" she asked, her voice barely above the whisper of the breeze. Thyra smiled, the edges of her lips lifting with gentle certainty. Yes, it will come. But so will the spring. And with it, new beginnings. The three of them sat in quiet companionship, the night wrapping around them like a shield. Above, the ravens of Odin circled silently, their calls a timeless echo across the land. The cycle of life and death, of hardship and renewal, was unbroken. In that fragile moment, Thyra felt the weight of the past lift slightly, replaced by the steady pulse of a future unwritten but claimed with open hands. The last winter had changed everything, freed her from chains seen and unseen, bound her to new kinship, and forged a spirit unbreakable. As the fire's embers glowed softly, carrying warmth into the cold night, Thyra Freyja's daughter embraced the dawn of her new life. Yet now, as the distant cries of ravens echoed over the fjord, she felt a quiet stirring within, a fragile light, faint but insistent. It was a warmth born not of fire, but of choice. The choice to stand, to fight, to protect. The choice to reclaim her name and her story from the hands that sought to define her. Beside her, Ragnar stirred, his scarred hand reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from her face. His eyes held a softness that had been absent for years, a silent acknowledgment of the journey they had shared. They had been master and thrall, warrior and servant, but those roles had dissolved like snow in spring. What remained was something neither of them had dared to name: trust, respect, perhaps even something like kinship. Iris slept peacefully nearby, her small chest rising and falling in the quiet rhythm of rest. The child was a living testament to the fragile sanctuary they had built, one born not of blood, but of choice and courage. Thyra's gaze softened as she watched her, a fierce protectiveness folding around the girl like a shield. Outside, the world remained harsh and unyielding. The scars of winter ran deep across the land and in the hearts of its people. Battles had been fought, alliances tested, and old wounds reopened. But from the frost and shadow, a new story had taken root, a story of defiance and redemption. Thyra's thoughts drifted to her uncle, Gorm Haraldson, and the bitter confrontation that had changed everything. His greedy claim had been met not with silence or submission, but with steel and fire. He had sought to own her as property once more, to barter her like a prize, but had found instead a warrior forged from the harshest trials. She remembered the moment the axe had hovered at her throat, the cold edge of threat slicing the air. But in that frozen instant, the fear that once gripped her heart had been replaced by something fiercer: defiance, a refusal to be broken again. The courage to declare that she belonged to no one but herself. And in the cold aftermath of battle, as blood mingled with snow and silence, she had discovered something unexpected. Freedom was more than chains removed. It was the power to choose, to stand alongside those who respected her as an equal, and to protect what she loved with every ounce of strength. The last winter had been more than a season of cold and hunger. It had been a crucible, shaping Thyra into a woman who no longer feared the night, who no longer bowed to the weight of betrayal. It had forged a bond between her and Ragnar, a bond tempered by hardship and softened by shared vulnerability. Now, as the first breath of spring whispered through the fjord, she felt poised on the edge of a new beginning. The frost was melting, revealing the stubborn earth beneath, a land eager to awaken and grow, just as she was. The village had begun to heal as well. Old fears were giving way to cautious hope. The stories of Thyra's defiance spread, not as tales of rebellion alone, but as legends of survival and strength. The people looked to her not as a mere thrall or a victim of circumstance, but as a leader, a symbol that even in the darkest winters, the human spirit could endure and rise. Ragnar's role had shifted too. The fierce warrior, once a solitary figure shrouded in mystery and menace, had found in Thyra and Ira a family, a purpose beyond battle. His scars told stories of conflict, but his eyes now held a quiet peace, the kind that comes from knowing that the fight was no longer against the world alone, but for something worth protecting. Thyra, the child once lost and afraid, now laughed with tentative joy, her footsteps light across the thawing earth. She was the living promise of renewal, the fragile thread weaving the past and future together. Thyra's heart swelled with a complex tapestry of emotions, grief for what had been lost, gratitude for what had been found, and a fierce determination to shape what was still to come. She thought of the gods, their silent watch over the land and its people. Odin's ravens still soared high, their cries a reminder that fate was ever in motion. Yet within the endless cycle of life and death, Thyra had claimed her own fate. No longer a pawn in the games of power and blood, she had become the author of her own story. The path ahead was uncertain, strewn with challenges yet unseen. The scars of winter would remain, as would the memories of betrayal and loss. But beneath it all burned a fire unquenchable, a fire of hope, resilience, and the unyielding will to live free. She rose from her seat, stepping to the doorway where the dawn stretched pale and slow across the fjord. The air was crisp, scented with pine and the promise of thaw. Her breath came steady, the rhythm of life itself. Behind her, Ragnar and Thyra followed, their presence a quiet testament to the bonds forged in fire and ice. Together, they faced the horizon, a small but unbreakable triad standing against the vast wilderness. Thyra Freyjasdottir was no longer the girl sold into chains. She was a woman who had fought for her freedom, who had chosen to protect the vulnerable, and who had embraced the uncertain light of a new day. And in that choice lay the true meaning of strength, the courage to break the cycle, to rise beyond the shadows of the past, and to walk forward unafraid. For in the harsh lands of the north, where winter's bite could claim the strongest of bodies, it was the spirit that endured, the heart that refused to yield, that carried one beyond survival into the realm of living. As the ravens circled above, their calls weaving through the crisp morning air, Thyra whispered a silent vow to the gods and to herself. No longer a thrall, no longer a victim, free. The story was hers to tell. And so, beneath the watchful eyes of Odin, amidst the endless cycle of frost and flame, the last winter's cold had melted away, not just from the land, but from the hearts of those who dared to defy it. If this story moved you, if Thyra's journey touched something within, then stand with us. Subscribe, share, and join the path of those who seek to remember the past, not as mere history, but as the living pulse of courage and choice. Because even in the darkest winter, the flame of hope burns quietly, waiting to be kindled. And with each new dawn, a free spirit rises. Thank you for walking this path with us. The saga continues.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.